Let's discuss with MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, MS Now contributor Inzamam Rashid in Dubai, executive director of the Soufan Center, Colin Clark, and senior advisor at CSIS, retired Marine Colonel Mark Kansian. So, guys, we just heard Secretary Hegseth say many more vessels are transiting the Strait of Hormuz. We don't have today's numbers, but 11 ships passed both Friday and Saturday. Keep in mind, the typical average is 138 vessels per day. So, David, what more did we hear from the Pentagon on this? And do we know which ships have actually made it through the strait?
The ships that have made it through, several of them are Pakistani-flagged ships, and that was Iran, I think, trying to thank Pakistan for its diplomatic efforts. But I just want to back up this broad framing from the President and Secretary Hegseth. Gas prices will continue to rise in the United States as long as the Strait of Hormuz is closed. This statement that we don't get any of our oil is not true. It's a global oil market. The fact that gas prices are higher in the U.S. show that. So this isn't just sort of a European problem. And then in terms of the number that are getting through, it's 150 a day, as you said. That's 150 total have gotten through this entire last month. There are 2,000 ships that are stuck right now in the Strait of Hormuz. So the Strait of Hormuz is closed. And the Iranian Navy, and it was interesting, Secretary Hegseth said this, one of the objectives of this whole war is to end the ability of the Iranian Navy to power project. Yeah. They're doing that. They have blocked the Strait of Hormuz. We have not defeated the Iranian Navy. So this is a huge problem that will continue for American consumers if President Trump decides to just walk away.
Well, and the strait only became a problem after the war began. Colin, if the U.S. were to wind down this war without securing the strait, a problem, again, only created by this war, would that leave Iran with major leverage going forward? Would they suddenly hold most of the cards?
It would be a huge boon to the Iranians, without question, and it would be essentially foreign policy malpractice on the part of the Trump administration by allowing Tehran to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a toll booth, essentially, and allowing, saying who's allowed to pass and who's not, and gaining massive sums of money in the process, which is going to further strengthen the regime that the administration sought to depose. So there's just so many own goals here on the part of the administration. And a lot of people are concerned about, the administration's competence in prosecuting a ground operation if that does go forward.
Colonel Kansian, this morning, President Trump addressed allies concerned about the situation in the strait, allies he cut out of the war planning, by the way. He says, quote, number one, buy from the U.S., referring to oil. We have plenty. And number two, build up some delayed courage. Go to the strait and just take it. Colonel, is that a realistic proposition?
Unfortunately, it's not. Our allies collectively do have substantial military capabilities, but they aren't designed to work together to do an operation like this. The United States needs to lead such an operation. The allies could provide very important support, particularly for minesweeping. The United States has basically turned that over to allies over the last 30, 40 years. So the straits could be open. It's doable. It would be a major combat operation, and there would be casualties, and the allies could be helpful in doing that.
The main concern in the White House seems to be that this standoff over the strait will extend the war beyond Trump's preferred timeline. Colonel, should the timeline be dictating the tactics and strategy, or is it usually the other way around?
Well, clearly the two have to work together because there's a timeline that's often driven either by military requirements or by political requirements. And ultimately, this is about political settlement. On the other hand, the administration does want to get things prepared. There was talk in the presser about setting the conditions, which is a military term for getting everything ready for a military operation. It's possible that putting the pieces together to open the straits.
Inzamam, the White House has also floated Arab nations footing the bill for this war, combined with potential Iranian control of the strait here. How do you think this is all being received in the Gulf?
Well, Anna, the Gulf countries didn't want this war in the first place, but now we are in this conflict. They want it to end, and they want it to end with a conclusive ending as well. That conclusive ending meaning that essentially they want regime change inside of Iran so that they don't live with a dangerous neighbor like Iran throwing missiles and drones into this country like we've seen happen over the last 5 weeks, not just the UAE, but of course other countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain as well. And so I think the Gulf countries on one hand will be incredibly concerned to hear that President Trump could be pulling out of this conflict whilst leaving the Strait of Hormuz in the situation that it is, essentially in Iranian control. Because here as well in the UAE, an oil-rich country, we've now seen gas prices increase by more than 30% since this conflict began. And we know that for a long time, President Trump has said that these are countries with a lot of money. You know, he's spoken consistently about the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi in particular, having a lot of money. And so he's probably thinking that, well, the Gulf countries can pick up the bill of this war even months and years after it finishes and after the US pull out. Already, though, we are feeling the economic effects here of this conflict. And so I think the Gulf countries today will be pretty concerned by the president's comments. I think just one point as well, though, some analysts here are suggesting to me that actually these comments about pulling out of this conflict whilst the Strait of Hormuz remains in Iranian control, despite the fact that there are some vessels passing through. I think analysts are suggesting that these could be empty words from the president. In fact, they could be a bit of a threat to the European Union, to NATO, to actually send some military facilities here to try and take back control of these waters, or even potentially to try and justify any sort of ground invasion and serious military attacks over the next few weeks to take back control of the waters, to allow oil to pass through, but also potentially justification for any sort of ground invasion on Karg Island, that island which we know is so vital to Iranian economy because it holds around 90% of its oil storage. So potentially it could just be a way of threatening these European countries, NATO allies as well. But certainly I think the Gulf countries will be concerned about these comments, Anna.
What also strikes me here, Inzamam, is that despite President Trump's threats against Iran for keeping the strait closed, Iran seems emboldened in some ways. Iran's parliament just approved imposing tolls on ships in the strait. Doesn't look like they're planning to relent anytime soon. If they were to enact tolls on ships passing through, how much of a recalibration would that cause for the region?
Well, look, I think every time these comments come out from President Trump, or we see an increase of fire from Israel into Iran, like we've seen over the last few days, particularly targeting infrastructure like heavy water plants, like also civilian nuclear sites, as well, then Iran's backs go against the wall and they retaliate. They retaliate not just with words, but with action. Today we saw an oil tanker, a Kuwaiti oil tanker, which was docked up in the sea, not far from where I am here in Dubai. That was targeted, that was struck. Fire coming out of that. 24 of the crew members there had to be rescued. So Iran retaliates. And I think to this point on charging vessels, well, look, if they have control of these waters, which they do currently, they can essentially do what the hell they like. And they have been doing that. They've been charging some vessels up to $2 million to pass through this waterway. So I think that will be a concern, not just for the Gulf countries here, Anna, but it definitely should be a concern for Donald Trump and the US administration.